Hello there, my name's Ian, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So today we're going to talk about 70s quad mixes, and joining me again from immersiveaudioalbum.com is my friend Jonathan Cornell. Welcome back, Jonathan. Good to see you.
Glad to be here, and I've been looking forward to this video. So yeah, it's gonna be good.
Gonna be fun. So maybe to get us started, you could give us a little introduction and history of the quad format.
Sure. So this is a subject that's very near and dear to me because my dad was a huge fan of quad and collector of vinyl and tape and gear. So perhaps unlike a lot of your viewers, I have an analog quad setup. I have the various types of decoders you need to play the quad records. I have an 8-track and reel-to-reel machine. So yeah, so I feel like I've heard probably a lot of what's out there. Not necessarily everything, but a good amount. And one of the reasons why I thought this would be an interesting topic for video is because a lot of these 70s quad mixes have been reissued on modern formats like Blu-ray or DVD or SACD. In fact, just recently, Rhino has been doing this initiative they call the Quadio series, which are Blu-ray discs that have high-res transfers of some 70s quad mixes they have in their vaults from the, Warner, Elektra, and Atlantic labels. But I think the kind of the most important thing to say right off the bat is I think quad was a lot bigger than people might have realized. I mean, a lot of effort was put into this. All the big equipment manufacturers that we know today, like Sony and Marantz and Panasonic, all made quad gear. All the big labels were in on it. Warner Brothers, Columbia, CBS, RCA, Capitol. And I would say pretty much every big artist of like the early to mid 70s, like all the biggest bands you could think of, some of which we're going to talk about, had at least one album that came out in quad. I mean, there are some exceptions. For instance, there were no Led Zeppelin albums that were mixed in quad, unfortunately. Even though Atlantic did release quad records, I always thought that was strange. But and all like the big studios like Abbey Road in the UK or the Record Plant in LA or Caribou Ranch, which was where Frank Zappa recorded his One Size Fits All record. All of those studios were equipped for 4-channel mixing. So I would say there was kind of almost as much effort put into this, to push it onto consumers as there is with like Dolby Atmos today. The biggest difference, though, between quad and these new formats that we know, like 5.1 and Atmos, is that the consumer experience wasn't necessarily analogous to what the engineers heard in the studio. Because the primary format that people were listening to music on in the 70s was vinyl. So your choices were either vinyl or some kind of tape. And it was very easy to adapt tape formats for quad because they support, multi-track audio. So the first quad format was a 7.5 IPS tape. And I have here the quad tape version of Deep Purple's Stormbringer album. And as you probably know from your tape transfer restoration work, Ian, 7.5 IPS is a pretty robust format. Like these tapes sound good even today. But not every quad album was released in this format. For the most part, it was really only Warner that did a handful of releases in these kind of tapes, and they were very expensive. So then your second choice after that was something called an 8-track cartridge. I don't know if any people remember these. And I would say that even though these are a discrete format in the sense they have discrete separation between the channels, the frequency response is quite poor. They don't really have a lot of top end or bottom end. It's all kind of mid-range, and they don't sound particularly great, I would say. But, I've had the opportunity to record some of these in and try to clean them up, in Pro Tools using noise reduction software at EQ, and it's surprising what you can get out of them sometimes. And then, of course, with vinyl, they had come up with a number of different processes to try and fit the 4 channels onto what is essentially a 2-channel medium. And the dominant way of doing it was using something called a matrix decode. So the way this would work in Columbia Records, the inserts that came with their quad records have a fun little diagram where they kind of explain the process. But essentially, the 4-channel master would be collapsed down to 2 tracks. And then when you would buy the record, you would use a like outboard decoding box. There's a picture of some options here. And it would like unfold the mix back to 4 channels. So you would start with 4 channels, it would go down to 2 channels, then get turned back into 4 channels on the consumer stereo. But unfortunately, it's not really possible to fully reverse the process of summing the channels together. So you would end up with kind of this watered down version of the quad mix where, say, like something was supposed to be mixed only to the back left speaker. If you were sitting in the middle of the room, it would sound loudest in the back left speaker, but you'd hear like bleed from it in the other channels. So the whole soundstage would sort of collapse on itself, and you would get this sense like you could hear music around you, but you're missing that discrete separation of instruments. So particularly with the Columbia Records releases, and Columbia was one of the biggest supporters of quad, you were kind of put in this unfortunate position where you had to choose between perfect separation and poor sound, or good sound and poor separation. But fortunately today, a lot of these mixes have been released on, like we said, Blu-ray or SACD, so you can finally hear like what it was supposed to sound like. You get the perfect separation and good sound quality. But one of the things we were talking about just before this is how a lot of these mixes sound kind of strange by modern standards, particularly like some of the earliest albums that were done in quad. Like one of the very first popular records to be released in quad was Santana's Abraxas, which we're going to talk about later in the video. And it's like one of the most gimmicky mixes you'll ever hear. Like there's the guitar swirling around. Pretty much all the instruments are mixed hard to each corner. And I suspect the reason they did this, aside from just trying to wow people, you know, the kind of with this early release to show off technology, I think the engineers knew that because of the nature of this decoding process, they would lose separation. So I think they would intentionally make the mixes very wide to kind of account for this. Now, I don't know that for sure. Unfortunately, a lot of the engineers who mixed these albums in quad are no longer with us, and it would have been interesting to get the answers to these questions. But I would say when you're listening to these mixes, you can't really judge them like the same way you would judge like a modern 5.1 or Atmos mix, because there were all these different factors involving limitations of the technology at the time that explain why sometimes they can sound a little bit strange.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But what kind of surprised me in doing the listening and research for this video is just how great some of them are.
Oh yeah.
Like I expected them to be creakier than what they actually are. And then, you know, we're going to talk about Tull in a minute, but like I think War Child is an example of a very inconsistent mix, where it's like you have these big leaps in dynamics that don't really make any sense. And some tracks sound great, and then other songs sound a little bit unfinished.
I think it's like anything else. Like the earliest 5.1 mixes weren't particularly great, and they got better as they went on. And you could say the same thing about Atmos. And the other thing is that the recording technology improved pretty quickly over the 70s. So the earliest quad albums that were mixed in probably 1971 or 72, most studios were probably still using 8-track recorders. So there aren't really that many available elements to start with. But by the end of the quad era, you know, 75, 76, we're into 16-track, 24-track. And usually the more elements you have to start with, the more, you know, latitude you have to experiment in any kind of surround mix, be it quad, 5.1, or Atmos.
And then you had recording techniques. I'm sure you kind of touched upon this, but you had recording techniques also growing. And, you know, like you read the liner notes for the new Zappa set, the one size fits all set. And, you know, Joe Travers talks about how Frank was miking the drum set and the keyboards to be specific for quad. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it almost feels like they stopped doing it like just as it started to get interesting.
Right. I guess we should introduce what we're going to do here. So, we kind of cross-referenced what we both have physically and otherwise, and decided, well, hey, here's 10 artists that have several releases. So the way that this conversation is going to be structured is we're going to talk about 10 artists and kind of get into the different releases.
These are 10 artists who had quad releases in the 70s, but the quad mixes have been reissued on modern formats that you can buy today.
Correct. Yeah, although some of them are a little harder to get hold of than
Yes,
others.
that's true.
But I'm just going to go by the list that you provided and start with the Jethro Tull quad
Sure.
mixes. So this is a really interesting topic because you have two quad mixes that were released, and then you have 2.5 that weren't released until the box sets came out.
Yeah.
And
So I've got in front of me. So the albums that were released were War Child. This is the original quad pressing. And of course, Aqualung, which was probably I would say it's their most popular record. I think that's a fair statement. Yeah. So these are the two that were released on vinyl, and there were also quad tape variants of these on 8-track and reel-to-reel. And then, as you know, we've talked about in other videos on the channel, there are the modern reissues with Steven Wilson's remixes of these albums. So in 2011, there was a big box set of Aqualung that has a Blu-ray with Steven Wilson's 5.1 mix and a high-res transfer of the original quad mix. And then later on, that Aqualung was reissued again in a book-sized edition, where the 5.1 mix is a different mastering, because the original version was, well, the 5.1 mix is a flat transfer on this. The original version was mastered by somebody else. Yeah. So I think this is the Steven Wilson mix on this is a little bit more true to what I think he intended for it to sound like. But the quad transfer on this is the same as on the Blu-ray. And then, of course, we have the War Child reissue, which also has the high-res quad mix. But then, as you mentioned, that we found out from these book sets that for whatever reason, after quad died off, that Ian Anderson and Robin Black, who was the engineer that worked on all these classic Tull records from the 70s, they continued mixing the albums in quad. So there was a quad mix of the complete Minstrel in the Gallery album, which they found, in the vault, that no one had ever heard until 2015. There's also a complete quad mix of the Too Old to Rock and Roll album. Again, nobody had ever heard. And then Songs from the Wood, 1977. So this is kind of long after quad is gone. There were 4 tracks, so I think like half the album that was mixed to quad. And my guess is at that point they realized, like, no one's ever going to hear this. It's not coming back. So they didn't finish mixing the album. But it's very interesting, to hear these after all these years.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder why they would go to the trouble and spend the money on something that they wouldn't release. And I have a couple of theories on that. And the one that I'm kind of most convinced of is that maybe they mixed half of the songs from the Wood album because Ian Anderson wanted to hear what those songs would sound like. Maybe they'd never intended it to be released, because if you look at the songs that were mixed, they are some of the more instrumentally complex songs,
like Velvet Green, songs.
Yeah, like Velvet Green or Jack and the Green, which famously is Ian Anderson playing all the tracks. So I think that has a lot to do with it. That was a very textured album, and maybe Ian Anderson just did it basically for his own interest, own amusement.
Well, if you check out the liner notes to the War Child reissue, which I hadn't read them in a long time, but
I haven't either.
There was a brief sidebar at the beginning from Ian where he talks about the quad mixes. And
interesting.
Basically, he kind of says that it was like an initiative from the record label, which was Warner in the US. And interestingly, War Child was the one that was done first. It was a new album. And then they went back and they redid Aqualung. So the Aqualung, the original record, came out 1971, which was before Warner Brothers was doing quad. So the quad mix was done a few years later in 1974. So it was kind of like a retrofit mix. But he mentions that part of the reason why they kept doing them was the Jethro Tull, the band, or I guess Ian, they had designed this mobile recording studio called the Maison Rouge, like a recording truck that they themselves owned. And the truck was equipped with a quad mixing system. So he says in the liner notes that he was kind of like, well, like, I'm not too crazy about this technology, which I thought was interesting. Like, he was kind of like, the record company told me to do it. Like, it wasn't really something I was that interested in myself. But like, if this catches on, like, we can't be left behind. Right. So I think they just sort of stockpiled them in case like the technology came back. because
Interesting.
quad kind of died off mainly around like 75, but they
Yeah.
were kind of like, well, we could keep doing these mixes, maybe it'll come back in a few years, and it just never did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and then of course 5.1 came
Yes.
around what, like 25 years later or something like that. So it's interesting that this is something, my friend says that quad is a lot like Back to the Future. You guys aren't ready for that, but your kids are going to love it.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about these Tull quad mixes, because in some cases they're pretty weird, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I would agree with that. Interesting to say the least. Weird, probably to say the most. But I did have a listen to, because some of these I haven't listened to in months, but I had a listen to Aqualung last night. And the first thing that I noticed, and I think you mentioned this, was that it's very reverb heavy. And like the whole like placing reverb on rhythm guitar is not something you usually hear in an early 70s album. And I wonder if that was done because that album always did kind of have like a weird sound to it, and maybe they were just trying to fill it out a little bit. But I always thought that the complaint that the band had at the time was that the studio itself was too reverby, and they were looking for a drier sound. So I'm not sure why they chose that, but on the whole, I don't think Aqualung is a poor mix by any stretch of the imagination. I think it sounds rather good. It turns up well, and when it's successful when it's at its most successful, like on songs like My God, it's perfectly immersive in my opinion. Now there's other songs like Up to Me, which comes right before it, and it's wacky. Like it has things that are all over the place. And there's also some interesting things, like it sounds like they used a different vocal take on the Sun Streaking Cold bit.
It doesn't have like the telephone EQ on it.
Yeah. Is that what it is?
Which is, I'm not sure. Well, I know for sure it doesn't have the telephone EQ, because that's
right.
Obvious when you listen to it, but I'm not sure if it's just the same take without the processing or not.
Yeah.
But that is kind of like one of the signature parts of that song. So that is a little weird when you listen to it.
It's like jarring. And then I noticed, of course, Wind Up is like the obvious choice because it almost sounds like a different take.
It's
a guide vocal.
It's a completely different performance.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the entire thing is different, and it's in a higher register than the original. Wow. Like when I listened to it, I was surprised like Ian could go that high singing it.
Yeah, because it almost sounds like a guide vocal or something on it, because he sounds to me very, very weakened vocally. And that could be why, is because it was a register he wasn't comfortable in.
Now, the interesting thing about this is that in a lot of cases, as is so often with any kind of surround mix, these mixes tend to be done by people who are not connected to the original recording.
Right.
But in this case, the mixes were done by Robin Black and Ian himself.
Right.
So I'm surprised that they're so different sounding than the stereos.
Yeah.
But another point kind of worth making is I think we look at these with a modern lens. There's a lot of cases where when these older albums get mixed, these older albums from the 60s, 70s, 80s get mixed in surround today, you have to kind of be faithful to the original, because people have been listening to these records for decades and they have kind of a muscle memory of how they sound. And that's the whole Steven Wilson thing, right? And that's why people love his mixes. But in the 70s, even though this mix was done after the stereo, it was still like a pretty new album. Like it was only released 3 years ago. So I think that whole like be faithful to the original mindset like didn't really exist at the time.
No, they had no idea this stuff was still going to be listened to in 50 years.
Exactly. Yeah.
How could they know that? And two other things I want to mention briefly is that there was a fold down of the Wind Up quad mix released on this version of Aqualung from 1997. So of all the tracks on the quad mix, that was the one I was most familiar with, because it is an extra on this. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was that, did you notice that the drums drop out on Locomotive Breath right at the end?
No, actually, that's interesting.
I've never noticed it before, but the drums like fall out, and then the ending is like there's like an accent placed on the ending that's not there otherwise. And I thought, wow, I've been listening to this for a lifetime and I've never noticed that before.
I mean, to me, I think that was probably the most successful track in the mix.
Probably, yeah.
One of the things I think is cool about it, for the most part, I would rather listen to Steven Wilson's 5.1 mix from 2011. I think
Yeah.
for the most part, that's generally a better version. But one thing I do think is cool is those like, guitar licks during the verses in Locomotive Breath, the that sort of come and go. They're like placed in the back right speaker and really like jump out at you. The flute solo in Locomotive Breath comes out of the back, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. So yeah, like I agree with you. I don't think it's a bad mix. It's not a very faithful to the stereo mix, and I think it's a little heavy-handed in adding reverb to stuff.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting alternate version of the record that's fun to listen to, and I'm glad that it was reissued on DVD and Blu-ray so more people can hear it.
Yeah, I agree with that take. Like it's there's a warmth to it that you get when you turn that on. But I think I'm especially forgiving of it because there is a superior 5.1 mix now. And this is now like a fun novelty, like an alternate way of listening to the album.
I mean, that's the case with all these Tull records, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the other thing that I was going to mention is that there are some missing elements from Up to Me. And it's interesting because now, what's the song right before? I think it's, Wondering Aloud. On the quad mix, it's almost like Wondering Aloud segues into Up to Me, because of course on the original mix and then also on the 5.1 mix, you have Jeffrey Hammond laughing at the start of it, but the quad mix just kicks right in. And I thought that was kind of interesting. So it's almost like it's coming out of the acoustic side of the album.
In general, I thought that like Aqualung, as we mentioned, there are a lot of mix differences, but on War Child, for the most part, it feels kind of similar to the stereo.
It does, except that I found it kind of wacky, honestly. And it's a wacky album. It's kind of a circusy, fun, goofy album, and a little uneven anyway. But I found that certain songs sounded really good, and then certain songs didn't. And I also noticed that there are some level differences where things jump out more. And I kind of mentioned this earlier in the video, but things jump out that really shouldn't. And there was a moment in Ladies where like the drums come in and I felt like that is way too loud. That's a huge leap in dynamics. And, generally I'm in favor of dynamic range, but it was like too much. But some songs sounded really good. And again, like I haven't listened to this mix in a month, but I remember feeling like Skating Away sounded pretty good. And then songs
yeah, in general, it sounds like very like kind of muted to me, fidelity wise.
You mean fidelity wise? Yeah, I would agree with that.
Especially if you go to the Steven Wilson mix, like if you listen to like Skating Away in there, like the instruments really leap out at you. And it kind of feels like there's like a blanket over it in the quad mix. Like, I don't know if it would have benefited from a little like top end EQ boost or something. But interestingly, a lot of the choices for how things are placed are not terribly different from the Steven Wilson mix.
I noticed that too.
Some of it is kind of obvious. Like in Bungle in the Jungle, you're going to put the strings in the rear.
Yeah.
In the third Hurrah, you're going to put the hurrah vocals in the rear. So a lot of that stuff is kind of a no-brainer, but it's interesting. I wonder if he listened to these when he did the 5.1 mixes.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because, as we'll talk about with the Zappa mixes, Eric and Karma do listen to the Zappa quad mixes. So I was curious about that because as we move forward to Minstrel in the Gallery, I thought the placement was even more similar between the Wilson and the quad mixes. And, one of the weird things, I don't know if we're ready to move on to Minstrel in the Gallery yet, but one of the weird things about that album in general is that Jeffrey Hammond's bass is often panned hard left on the stereo mix. And that carries over to the quad. You've got him all the way over. So it's
even on the Steven Wilson stereo remix, like he narrowed it a little bit, but the bass is still like partially on the left. So I thought it was interesting that he kept that in the 5.1 mix. It is, I think, centered though.
It is centered. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I did notice this situation where sometimes the more acoustic tracks sounded better fidelity wise on Minstrel, and oftentimes it's got kind of that same issue like you were talking about with War Child, where it's got like a blanket. Sounds like it's blanketed. But I think overall the Minstrel mix is much more successful, in my opinion, than the War Child mix. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. One thing I did notice that was interesting in Minstrel, though, I don't know that album as well as the others, but one thing that did jump out to me in A being them is the lead guitar in Cold Winds of Valhalla is a different performance on the quad mix.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I need to go back and hear that.
At least parts of it are. But
Interesting.
I would say though, as far as the 5-1 mixes go, that might be one of my favorite ones. I hadn't listened to it in a while, but like, man, there's some great songs in that record. Like the title track is just killer when
It
the
is.
drums come in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love Ian's vocal performance at the end there of the title track.
And the acoustic stuff on it, like One White Duck. I mean, what a great, basically just like a solo performance. Yeah.
Well,
great record.
I think the story was that the band were out playing tennis or something, and because they were in the Monte Carlo, so they were like having their vacation basically, and Ian Anderson was doing a lot of that stuff himself. So it's kind of like a early example of an Ian Anderson solo album. And that's how you end up with so many, like so much of Baker Street Muse is basically just Ian with the strings, which is lovely. And yeah, that was another thing I noticed. Like you said, with War Child, like the strings were oftentimes in the back and you kind of had the band up front. But again, that's really what you want. Like that seems like a good mix to me. Now, speaking of alternate elements, I'm not sure if it's different or just more prominent, but I noticed a little bit more of Martin's guitar at the very end of Baker Street Muse. That maybe it was just buried in the mix before, but I thought, wow, I don't really remember hearing that before.
But yeah, my thought listening to it was it's too bad this wasn't released on vinyl in the 70s. Because in some ways, it's the best of the three we've talked about for Aqualung and War Child. And then Too Old, I think we're back to kind of weirdness with the panning.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't spend a whole lot of time with that one, but I mentioned this to you, kind of through Messenger, but I find that one the most special of the, what do we say, 4.5, 3.5, whatever it is.
Yeah. So just so people know, because I knew nothing about this record before it was released on this special edition in, I think 2016. This came out, or 2015. But there's kind of two studio recordings of the album. There's the original record that we know, and then there was a redone version that was like re-recorded for a TV show. And there's a whole story about why they had to do this. It had to do with like musicians union rules. So there are two completely, multi-tracked in a studio recordings of the album. And when they went back to remix it for stereo and 5.1, they found that not all the tapes were available for the original recording that was on the vinyl. Right. But they did have the complete tracks for the TV show version. So this box set has a couple of original tracks that were mixed by Steven Wilson, I think like 2 or 3 songs, and then the entire TV show version. But as you mentioned to me, the quad mix is based off of the original LP version, which the multi-tracks are no longer available for.
Yeah.
So it's the only way to hear the entire original LP version in surround. So I agree, it is special for that reason.
Which has some different arrangements, like the Palmer arrangements are obviously not carried over as elaborately into the more quick one and done BBC version, because I think they knocked that out in just like a couple of days, that TV special, and it sort of feels that way, like it's got a little bit more energy than the original album does, and I might prefer it, as a performance, at least on the whole. But it's nice to hear some things that I haven't heard in a while, like the string arrangements. And I think Maddie Pryor shows up at one point.
I would say, as far as Tull albums go, like this is probably the one I've listened to the least. Like if I'm itching to hear some Tull, like this is rarely the album that I'd reach for. But I did go back, of course, and listen to the quad mix for this video. Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, there's a part in the song Quiz Kid where like Ian's vocal kind of moves around. There's that whole part where he's like, win a fortnight in Ibiza, something. And the way it moves around like makes no sense in the quad mix. Like it starts at the front and then it goes to like diagonal channels. And then, so I almost wonder if like it's possible maybe the channel mapping is not correct on the version that was done for the box set, because that is something that can happen. And in these Tull quad mixes, there are elements that are placed kind of centrally in the room. Like in the Steven Wilson mixes, like usually Ian's vocals in the center channel in front of you. And in the quad mixes, there are some things like the vocal and sometimes the bass that are in the middle of all the speakers. So it can get confusing to kind of assign the speaker channels because there's a lot of elements that are shared.
Yeah.
This is something that has happened with other reissues of 70s quad stuff where occasionally they don't quite get the mapping of the channels correct.
Right.
But yeah, like I would say, I think listening to this, it's like they knew no one was going to hear this. So they did it in like a day. You know?
It's got that quality to it. And it's also got that weird EQ to it as well. And now I did think that it turns up great. If you give it a little volume, I think it does sound quite good.
Well, you can say that about kind of all the audio on these Tull sets. You know, there's no brick walling, there's no smiley face EQ. Like everything sounds very natural on these sets, you know, beyond just the surround mixes, all the bonus material and everything. So if you're a fan of this band, as I know, you're the biggest Tull fan I know, these reissues are about as good as it gets.
Yeah. See, they're behind me in the bookcase. And I do have them and I would show them, but it's like they're too precious. Like they must be taken out with care. And you know, so I'm very, very careful with my Tull sets. But there's one thing I wanted to mention before we move on to Songs from the Wood, and we're going to bounce back to War Child and Minstrel for a minute. But I was fascinated by the fact that there's some bonus tracks that were mixed in quad.
Oh yeah, there's on War Child, there's that song March the Mad Scientist has
and Glory Row. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just didn't expect to hear those. I thought, why would they mix those?
I don't think those are on the LP.
No.
Like I think they had mixed those, were never heard before.
Yeah, and I just thought, why would they do those bonus, like, because I wasn't sure. I don't think they were ever considered for the album. And then with Minstrel in the Gallery, you get Summer Day Sands.
Well, War Child, as I recall from the book edition, is one of the ones that has the most bonus tracks.
Yeah, that's correct.
Maybe second only to Broadsword of the Beast, where there's kind of like a whole second album's worth of material.
Yeah.
I mean, all of them have a lot of... Stormwatch has a lot of bonus tracks too, and they're all mixed in surround, which is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Paradise Steakhouse is a cool tune in on the War Child set.
Yeah. And I don't think any of those extras, at least speaking for War Child, I don't think many of them were considered for the album. I think it was more just like, hey guys, I got this idea. Let's book some studio time and knock this out.
Well, aren't a lot of the songs on War Child originally recorded for the Chateau Disaster thing on the Passion Play set?
Only Solitaire is actually from Chateau de Hurville, and Skating Away on the Thin Ice of a New Day. Those are the only two that come from Chateau de Hurville. And they're the same recordings, just with overdubs, which is rather fascinating. But let's talk about Songs from the Wood. Now, I didn't spend too much time with this particular mix, but I did listen through everything, and I thought that like the stereo the separation was really good on it. I thought the fidelity was really good on it, but it's very thin. Like it's lacking the punch. And
then when you go over to the 5.1 mix, it's like, whoa, there's what I was missing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I mentioned this to you, but I think that the Tull stereo mixes, with maybe the exception of this album in particular, were always a little bit wonky. Like even the stereo mixes had kind of a weird sound to them. And that's why, like, as a Tull fan, the Steven Wilson mixes were so exciting. Like, these finally sound the way they should. And, you know, you mentioned an album like Stormwatch, and my dad's a major Tull fan too. So when I was growing up, he and I would talk about, why, because we both love Stormwatch. And like, why does Stormwatch have such a weird sound to it? And I remember we were having this conversation one time, you know, maybe it's not a remaster. Somebody needs to go back and remix this. And I think one of us said, you know, Ian Anderson would never allow that. And then here we are.
Yeah.
15, 20 years later, and I have most of them now. Of everything up through Broadsword and the Beast. So did you have any comments on Songs from the Wood?
I think, again, kind of like some of the other records, like some of the mixing choices are not dissimilar. Like at the beginning of Velvet Green, where there's all the different guitar parts spread across the different speakers. It's not unlike how Steven did it in his mix. But I agree with you that like if I was listening to this, like I would go for the 5-1 mix. Like the quad mixes are just kind of like a curious novelty.
Right.
But like I was saying before, by 1977, like quad was really long gone. Like the last Warner Brothers LP release was like 2 years prior. So it's crazy that they were still even thinking about this at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And we have like as kind of like an extra point. There are 2 Steven Wilson quad mixes that were done later on. And I didn't get a chance to listen to them, but obviously I have before, but this was done as a quad mix. And that's because it was recorded to 4-track.
Exactly. So in the liner notes of this was like there's a section from Steven where he explains like his whole approach to it. And like you said, the album was recorded on 4-track, so he felt there wasn't really an opportunity to use the center channel.
Right.
Though some of the bonus songs like Love Story, which is also on Living in the Past, was recorded on 8-track. So that's more of his traditional style of mix with the vocals in the center. But this was I think it's like what he did. It's not as impressive as the other albums because of the limited source. But
I would agree with that. Yeah,
it feels big, like when you listen to it in surround, like on a song like Someday the Sun Won't Shine. I forget what it's called. Like the backing vocals are in the rear, and then on some of the more instrumental tunes, it's kind of like there's guitar mixed to the left side or like flute mixed to the other side. And I think it's pretty well done, and the original recordings are quite good.
Yeah. Now, on Living in the Past, the new Living in the Past set, we get a couple of songs from that album. A song for Jeffrey is one of them, and that might be the only one that at least I can think of. But I noticed that on these new versions, he's mixed them in 5.1, and I wonder if because the issue with the original obviously is that the bass and the drums would have been married to the same track. They would have been cut to the same track. So I wonder if on this new version, some like stem separation technology has been in use, because there is a huge difference if you compare a song for Jeffrey on the new version compared to the quad version.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I would have to pull it down from the shelf, but if you look in the liner notes of the Still Living in the Past, it mentions which songs use stem separation and which don't.
Yeah.
But I agree, it was an improvement. So he was able to move the vocals back to the center on the new version.
Yep. And especially the drums and bass have more thump to my ears on the new version. Now, the other one I wanted to mention, and I just want to touch upon this briefly because I could literally talk Tull for the next 2 hours.
Of course.
And I have. But there is a quad mix of the show that's on the Broadsword set.
Yeah, live in Germany.
Yeah. I'm glad you remembered. I meant to check that, but I forgot. Yeah, live in Germany. And that's another case where I think that was done to 4-track. And that mix sounds fantastic to my ears.
Yeah. I mean, like I've said before, the Broadsword set, like in terms of like most bang for your buck content, like there's so much stuff on there. There's more stuff on that there is on most box sets.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about, we're going to move on to Chicago. Now, the only one I had a chance to listen to on this list was Chicago 2. So if you want to talk about these in a more general sense.
Sure. Well, Chicago 2 is the most relevant one because we just got this reissue this year.
I have some thoughts about that.
So there's this standalone Blu-ray you can get right now from Amazon or Rhino's store or wherever that's got the original quad mix. It has the 5.1 mix that was done in the early 2000s that was released on DVD audio. And it has a new Atmos mix by Steven Wilson, which I think is by far the best of the 3 versions. But to sort of go back and do some of the history, pretty much all of Chicago's albums up to that point, like their entire discography, was mixed for quad. All the albums that were released between, I think, 1969 and 76. So that's basically the entire kind of Terry Kath era. Mm-hmm. Terry Kath was on one more record, Chicago 11, before he passed away. So 1 through 1, or Chicago Transit Authority, through 10 were mixed in quad. And I don't have all the LPs in front of me, but I don't own them all, but I've got here's Transit Authority, the quad version. Chicago 5. Chicago 6. And Chicago 8 and the Greatest Hits album.
Nice.
So, and if you wanted to get these like in a modern format, in 2010, as sort of like a prelude to the Quadio thing we have now, there was a Quadio DVD edition of the Transit Authority record. This has been out of print for a long time, but it was remastered from the original 4-track master tape. And then a couple years after this, in 2016, there was, I think, one of my favorite surround releases ever, the Chicago Quadio box set, which has all of the albums that were mixed in quad.
Yeah, that's terrific.
As a 9 Blu-ray set. And like people were going crazy when this came out, because does it get any better than that? 9 albums in surround on in one set.
Was that the first of such box sets?
Of the Quadio ones, yes.
Yeah.
Since then we've had the Doobie Brothers one, and most recently the Joni Mitchell one, which we're going to talk about later in the video.
Yes.
But these mixes were done for the most part, by James William Guercio, who was the producer of all these albums and the owner of the Caribou Ranch studio. And he worked with tons of other bands in the 70s, like Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And I think he worked with Elton John as well.
Yeah, you're right.
And they were engineered by Wayne Tarnowski, who was the original recording engineer on pretty much all these albums. I have a friend, Dave, on the Quad Forum, who's a Chicago expert who would probably speak to this better than I could. But I think this was a rare instance in which kind of like the band's whole catalog and mass were mixed for quad. And I think these are among the best mixes of the era, in the sense that they are very true to the originals, and they have a lot of separation. Like it really feels like you're in the middle of the band. I would say maybe the first album mix is a little bit strange because it's the only one that was recorded on 8-track. So you can tell listening to it that the horns were all 3 horns, the trumpet, trombone, and sax were all recorded to 1 track. So typically the horns are all like in one corner instead of spread out around you like on the other albums. So that would be a good example for if they were to remix CTA again. It would be interesting to use stem separation to try to pull the horns apart.
Yeah.
But in general, I think these mixes are really good. I would say the only one that's a little bit strange at times, other than the aforementioned CTA, is the second album has some like alternate stuff in it.
Yeah, most notably on 25 or 6-4.
Yeah, so in the version of 25 or 6-4 that we all know, Terry Kath's like lead guitar only comes in during these short solos after the chorus. But it's clear from the quad mix that he basically played through the whole track. Like he just they played the track for him and he just went in and played a lot of guitar, and they kind of picked and choose the parts that they wanted. But in the quad mix, it sounds like the entire guitar track was just left open the whole time. So there's lots of like sort of obtrusive noodling that comes in during the song, and it's kind of cool to listen to the first time, but like I find it kind of annoying after a while.
Same here. Yeah, that I immediately switched over to the Wilson mix on that song to hear it back. It's like there's a lot of stuff I'm not used to hearing, and I switched back to the Wilson mix. I thought, okay, that sounds a lot better. But I would say overall, I thought that quad mix was fantastic. And one of the things that I noticed, like you were talking about Chicago Transit Authority, how the horns are like almost all the way justified in the back, and the band is very much justified in the front. And I noticed that on this album, that changes a lot. Like you sometimes the horns are up front and sometimes they're in the back, and then other times they're spread out. And I definitely think, I'm sorry.
I was going to say it's generally either pretty much the drums and lead vocal are always in the front, like you would expect in any modern surround mix, but usually either the horns are in front and then the organ and guitar are in the back, or sometimes it flips on a couple of the other songs where the guitar and organ are in the front and the horns are in the back. And one of the great things about the Atmos mix is because there's more speakers now, because there's 7 speakers on the ground. A lot of times the guitar and piano or organ are the sides, and the horns are in the back.
Yeah, that's
So,
interesting.
I mean, as we've talked about, I totally adore Steven Wilson's Atmos mix of this album. I think it's incredible. And it's certainly not a realistic representation in the sense that a lot of like the solos are mixed in the ceiling, but it sounds cool.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
but the point I was going to make is that the character of the Wilson mix is very, very different
Yes.
and more natural, I would argue. But for those of you who are maybe, maybe you really like the character of the original mix, I could see some people preferring the quad because it definitely sounds more like it originally sounded. Which again, not everybody likes that. I always thought that album had kind of a weird sound to it. That the Wilson mix kind of clears up, but it just seems like the quad is maybe more faithful to the original. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say in terms of like tonality. Like we said,
Exactly. Yeah.
there are some parts where like alternate takes are used and things, but
Yeah.
it's a very like mid-rangey album. Like
Yes.
there's not a lot of bottom, not a lot of top. And the remixes of it, the 5-1 that was done 20 years ago and the Wilson mix sort of try and enhance the top and bottom to varying degrees.
Mm-hmm.
The modern 5-1, the 2000s 5-1 mix, I think goes a little bit too far, trying to like make it sound modern. Like they really pump up the bass drum on that. It sounds kind of unnatural. Like it has this sort of like glassy, like they added a lot of treble and a lot of bass to it. It's like very hyped up. And the Wilson mix is like kind of somewhere in between. Like it sounds cleaner than the original, but it still has kind of the same aesthetic that you're used to. But I would say of all the albums, my favorite one for the quad mix is the 7th Chicago album, which I don't know if this is a record you're familiar with. But
No.
this is like, if you like your Chicago with a dose of like Weather Report or like Herbie Hancock, they were definitely doing some interesting kind of fusion-y stuff on this record. And I think it's the one that benefits the most from the quad because it's some of their most experimental songs.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a band I really need to spend more time with. The second album is the one I know the best, and I know the first one just a little bit. But I've heard so many good things about them.
The only other thing I'll mention is that there's the Greatest Hits collection, which is in quad, and it's also in the box set. And there's a standalone Blu-ray, like, I don't have it in front of me, but there's a standalone Blu-ray of the Greatest Hits that you can get today that's in print that has a new Atmos mix of the Greatest Hits done by somebody else, not by Steven Wilson. And it also has the quad mix. But the Greatest Hits, they are the same mixes compiled from the other albums, but some of them are single edits. So like, does anybody really know what time it is? As you may know from the album version, there's like this extended piano intro before the horns come in. And on the Greatest Hits, it just starts with the horns.
Interesting.
So the Greatest Hits is interesting for that reason alone.
Yeah, that's cool. It's cool that they included that in the box set then. But if I'm not mistaken, that release came out relatively recently.
The Greatest Hits standalone Blu-ray?
Yeah,
I think it came out last year.
Yeah, so that should be still easy to get a hold of. So I think we got Joni next on our list.
Nice.
And I'm excited to talk about this because I spent some birthday money on this.
Yeah, let me get it out here. So here it is. And again, like with Tull, it's a mix of things that were and weren't released.
Right.
So the albums that did come out in quad in the 70s were Court and Spark and The Hissing of Summer Lawns.
Okay.
Now, I always thought it was interesting that in between these two records, there was a live album released called Miles of Isles, which we talked about in our live albums video.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, Miles of Isles was not released in quad, even though it came out in between these two albums that were. So I always thought that was strange. And as it turns out, there was a quad mix of it done that was not released for some reason. So you can finally hear that in this box set. And then they also, for the album that came out before Court and Spark, it's called For the Roses here, they had Bruce Botnick do a modern quad mix of it. And of course, all of these albums also have the new 2022 Atmos mixes that Ken Calais and Klaus Trelby did, which are excellent. So there's a lot of great material on here, and I think all the mixes are good in their own way. The quad and Atmos mixes are very different, particularly Court and Spark. But I'm curious what your thoughts on these were.
Well, I haven't listened to the Atmos mixes yet. The only one I've heard is Hissing of Summer Lawns, and it's been years. I heard it on streaming. But somebody who's coming to some of these records for the first time, I was astonished by how good they are. Just Joni Mitchell has a certain sophistication to her that is kind of hidden, but it's like once you start digging into her words and the arrangements, especially, she's more than just a folk artist. Like there's jazz that runs through it. Some of the stuff kind of makes me think of Tull. Like there's the song on Court and Spark. I think it's Free Man in Paris, or maybe it's Help Me with the Flute. Tom Scott's playing the flute part. That very much reminds me of that very much reminds me of Tull in a way. But I found it very easy to play these albums again and again and again. Like I just kept wanting to dig in. In terms of like quad placement, I find the live album, Miles of Isles and The Hissing of Summer Lawns, to be the most satisfying in that respect.
Well, the elephant in the room is that on Court and Spark, the drums are in the back.
And I was getting to that. Yeah. And then you have these situations where, like on Court and Spark, where the drums are all the way in the back, which is as the kids would say, it's a choice. But it kind of makes sense for Joni because she's the center. She's the center of this universe, and everything else is kind of supporting her. So I don't mind that.
Well, you have to remember that we think about surround today as like kind of with 5.1 and Atmos. A lot of people are using bookshelf speakers with bass management. And yeah, like it sounds good. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But I think like bookshelf speakers didn't really exist like in a home scenario in the 70s. Like people had these big floor standers. So I think these albums were mixed with the intention that the back speakers were as big as the ones in the front. And I'm not saying like that means you have to have a system like that to listen to quad. I think it sounds fine if you listen to it on any kind of surround system. But it does explain why on a lot of quad albums there is a lot of low frequency content in the rears.
I noticed
there's some albums that have bass or drums in the back. It's not uncommon for 70s quad mixes. So yeah, this is a good example of it. And at least on this album, the drums are mixed like in stereo across the back. There are some quad albums where all the drums are in like one back corner, which is weird. Yeah.
But I noticed a lot of times like the kick was really thumping from the back of the room. And then you had the bass guitar up front. And so a lot of these albums are very bassy, but it's not like in an unsatisfying way. It's in a way that really works for me. So I find these an absolute joy to listen to. As for picking out specific things, it's kind of difficult because they all kind of blended together for me listening to them on a loop. But I was very impressed with them. Now, do you want to talk briefly about some of the differences between the quad and the new Atmos mixes?
Well, the most obvious difference is that in Court and Spark, the drums are in the front in the Atmos mix. And they're mixed kind of across the front wall. So like the main drums are in the bottom, and some of the tom fills are elevated a little bit, which is pretty cool. But I would say the quad mix, I mean, the Atmos mix is definitely more kind of front oriented. Like if you listen to some of the songs, like in Free Man in Paris, for example, the guitars are very much in the back along with the drums. So the quad mix is kind of like Joni and acoustic guitar in front and bass guitar and like everything else in the back. And in the quad mix, it's kind of flipped. Like the guitars are mixed out into the room, but not so far back. Drums are very clearly in the front, and some of the backing vocals and the flute thing, like you mentioned, is in the back. So in some cases, I think the choices in the Atmos mixes make a little bit more sense. One song that I think was potentially better though in quad was People's Parties. I liked how the I think what was it, like the acoustic guitar is mixed like directly behind you with the vocal in front. Since that's like an acoustic song, I thought that was really cool. The Atmos mix, it's kind of like the guitar is in all the speakers,
Mm-hmm.
and it has this kind of like big, it's almost like sort of a big stereo effect, but with less discrete separation. And for Hissing of Summer Lawns, I felt that the quad was actually quite a conservative mix compared to the
Interesting.
others. I mean, it kind of like on the Tull albums, the vocal is mixed out into the room a little bit. There's not a ton of like overt separation like on Court and Spark. But I think the one I would go back to the most, the one I certainly prefer the quad over the Atmos for, is the live album, Miles
Yes.
Vials. I mean, I love the soundstage in that. Like it's just like you're in the middle of the band, no frills, drums in front, guitar over there, sax over there, and Joni is kind of in the middle holding it all together.
Yeah. Yeah. That in general, that's one of my favorite, I think, multi-channel mixes.
Yeah. And the live versions of some of the songs are better than the studio cuts.
They are. Yeah. Especially Woodstock.
Yeah.
I think Woodstock is absolutely terrific on the live album. Now, we should mention that there is a new 2025 quad mix of Blue, which I don't have.
There's also an Atmos mix.
And there's an Atmos mix of that as well. And we didn't talk about For the Roses much, but those are two kind of sparser albums. Do you want to comment on those at all?
Sure. So I would say for Blue, if you get the new Blu-ray edition, like don't get too excited about a great surround mix, because there just isn't that much on it. A lot of it is kind of this like acoustic singer-songwriter confessional kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Some of the songs do have more elements. Like there's a song called Carrie on that record, which is also on Miles Vials, where there's some percussion and backing vocals that they were able to spread around the room. But both the quad and Atmos mixes are very kind of front oriented. For the Roses is a little bit more complex. Like you have songs like, You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio, or Cold Blue Steel and Sweet Fire, where they were able to move some elements around. The Atmos mix of that song, Cold Blue Steel, is incredible. I would definitely listen to that. You have horns in the back, guitar and backing vocals sort of next to you. I mean, that song sounds huge in Atmos. And the quad version is also good, but I would say the Atmos is better for that one.
That's For the Roses?
For the Roses, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
In the case of that one, the mixes were done by different people. The Atmos was done by Ken Calais and Klaus Strelby, and the quad was done by Bruce Botnick. And then in the case of Blue, both the Atmos and quad were done by Bruce Botnick.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got to go back and hear those Atmos mixes, because since we were preparing for the quad discussion, that's pretty much all I focused on for now.
But I would say, like, for you, if you're just getting into this and enjoying these albums, the next couple records after Hissing of Summer Lawns, like Hejira, Mingus, like I think you're really gonna like those, because
those are my favorites.
Those really amp up the jazz elements.
Yeah, those are my favorites. Like I came into Joni's music. I think Hissing of the Summer Lawns was the first one I heard. So I tend to be more solid on her through the latter 70s. And it's actually the early 70s albums that I'm kind of discovering for the first time.
But I would say on this box set, like for surroundiness or surround wow factor, the best things on it are the quad mix of Miles of Isles and the Atmos mix of Hissing of Summer Lawns. Those are the two that impressed me the most. But all of it's really good. This is a great set.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like you think it's expensive, and then when you hear it, you go, okay, I'm not thinking about how much it costs anymore. This sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Worth every penny. So, okay. Yeah. Good opportunity to talk some Joni. Let's talk some Santana. Now, I didn't get a chance to hear much of these. So perhaps you could give us an overview. I did hear
there's a lot of content here. So like, much like Chicago, basically the whole discography for the time that quad existed was mixed for this format. So that means if you're familiar with the band, that's from the first album all the way through. I believe the last one done for quad was called Festival, released in '76. And also all the collaboration albums that he did outside of Santana. So there's an album called Love, Devotion, Surrender that he made with John McLaughlin that was released in quad. There's also the Illuminations album with Alice Coltrane. I think he made an album with Buddy Miles. So all of that stuff was released in quad. So it's more than 10 titles that are out there. But in front of me, I've got, of course, the classic debut album. which, to me, this is like one of the best debut albums ever. Some
Mhm.
great, incredible stuff on this record. Then we've got, here it is. So as I mentioned, you can see from the earliest Columbia reissues, they had these gold borders and quad like in big writing when it was a new thing. And for like the later albums, like the logo would start to get smaller and smaller. So like the Santana first album, even though it came first chronologically, was released a couple years later. And you could see the quad iconography got like a lot smaller. But the first album, the second album, Abraxas, and then there's the third album, which is also just called Santana, but people call it Santana 3. And then I've also got Caravanserai in front of me, which is kind of the first of like a fusion trilogy, I guess you could say, with the next albums, Welcome and Borboleta, which were also released in quad. So the reason why we're talking about these is because Sony in Japan have been doing this cool reissue series. And they've been doing this for some other artists too, like Jeff Beck, who we're going to talk about, and Billy Joel, where they're releasing SACDs of these using the original quad mixes. And they come in this cool 7-inch packaging, like the size of a 45, that mimics the quad LP. So you can see it's like a perfect miniaturized version.
Oh, that's cool.
Of the quad. So I've got you'd see like they're exactly the same.
Yeah.
In the case of the first album, they had to use the US cover because there was no quad LP of the first album released in Japan. But for the other albums, like for Abraxas, they used the Japanese covers. So Abraxas, Santana 3, Caravanserai. And they've also done a couple more of them. Like they've done Borboleta, Welcome, Love, Devotion, Surrender. I just don't have them yet. But like we were talking about at the beginning of the video when I was talking about Matrix technology, the early Santana records, Abraxas and 3, were some of the first pop records from CBS that were released in quad. And you could tell in the mixes that their intention was to like really wow you with like gimmicks and things flying around. And also the albums were recorded on 8 tracks, so there's not that many sort of elements to move around. The other thing I find with these albums is that there's a bit of a bass deficiency compared to the stereo versions. I don't know if you found that. Particularly Abraxas and the third album seem to have less low end than the originals, even on the SACDs. But the mixes are like off the wall crazy. Like at the end of Black Magic Woman, the guitar is like swirling around you. There's a song called Everybody's Everything on the third record where there's like these horn blasts that sort of come and go. And every time you hear them, they're in a different speaker. But the music kind of calls for this stuff. Yeah. There's a lot of like wild percussion and things. The drum solo in Soul Sacrifice of the first record kind of like takes over the whole room. And, I think these are great records, particularly the first 3. I love the music on those. So I think these are all still in print. They're kind of hard to get because you have to import them from Japan. But like the packaging is really nice on them, and they do a great job on the audio as well. So, and then the only other thing I'll mention in there is that in the 1990s, there was also this DTS edition of Abraxas, which I've got here. DTS CD was kind of this early 5.1 format that preceded SACD and DVD audio. They started releasing these in the mid-90s, and a lot of them use transfers of old quad mixes. So, there's a tons of them. Like there's Paul McCartney's Band on the Run and Venus and Mars. There's a Bachman Turner Overdrive record, Not Fragile, that was released in this format. There's a Poco record. There's quite a few of them.
Yeah, I've got a Moody Blues, and I think I've got an Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Yeah, the Moody Blues is sourced from a quad mix as well. It's probably like Seventh Sojourn or Days of Future Past.
Days of Future Past.
But so this is the quad mix of Abraxas, but it's like a horrible sounding transfer of it. Like I don't know what they did. Like it has like tons of treble and like no bass. As I mentioned, the quad mix itself doesn't seem to have a lot of low end, but this version is even worse. So don't buy this. Buy this, which should be easy because this is out of print and this is still in print.
Good to know.
But so you were telling me you listened to a bit of the first record and the third one, I think?
I heard the first album, and to be honest with you, it wasn't wasn't like I didn't pay super close attention to like where the placement was or anything. It was more just like I kicked back and I really enjoyed it.
It's a great record.
It is. And what I enjoyed, I think the most, well, for one thing, when I was in high school band, we did a Santana show and we did Soul Sacrifice. So that it brought back like a lot of those memories of
funny. When I was in middle school, we did like a Santana medley.
Oh, cool.
Like, I remember it had like Black Magic Woman, like No One to Depend On. And it had of course it had the track he did with Rob Thomas,
Smooth. Yeah.
Which I think was his biggest hit ever.
I think so.
Which I find funny because he had all these albums in the 70s and it wasn't until the 90s that he got his biggest hit ever.
Yep. And it was crossover because he was crossing over with these pop artists. And I also think the 90s was kind of a boom for Latin influenced music anyway.
Yes.
Like you had Shakira coming out at that time and other things. So it makes sense. But yeah, we did a couple of songs. And the thing I was going to mention was that I appreciated the most, I think, that his music, at least the first album, seems to be exotic, but it's also familiar. Like you have like his influences, and then you have like some blues weaving in there. So it feels, like I said, very, very exotic, but at the same time also very familiar. So it's really enjoyable. And of course, his guitar playing he's one of the greats. Really, he's one of the greats of the era.
Well, on the third record, one of the things that's cool is that his sort of co-lead guitar player is Neil Schon from Journey. Before he was in Journey. So the two of them are doing these kind of like lead guitar trade-off solos. I think of the first three records, that's probably my favorite one, Santana 3. But I think for you, if you like sort of more proggy experimental music, I would check out those next three, Caravanserai, Welcome, and Borboleta, because those have more kind of exotic, those have more in common with like Weather Report and Mahavishnu than they do with like any of the stuff you hear on the first three records. And before I forget it, in front of me, I've also got the 8 tracks of Abraxas and their debut album.
Very cool.
But no need for these now that we have the SHTD versions.
So who owns his catalog in the States? Would that be a Rhino thing, or? It
would be Sony.
Sony, okay.
So, because it was originally Columbia Records, which is CBS, and now Sony.
Gotcha. Because I was thinking like that would make a killer box set.
It would be great to hear like new mixes of these albums.
Yeah.
Like if somebody could do like an Atmos mix of Abraxas and go back to the original tapes, that would be neat.
So Steven Wilson, do you think he's a Santana head?
If you listen to the Album Years podcast that he does with Tim Bowness, where they talk about a lot of the bands they like, I think they did mention Santana on one episode. So who knows?
Yeah, I've seen most of those, but I don't remember. But that he would be a good choice, I think, to do some of this stuff. But we're going to talk some Jeff Beck now. Speaking of greatest guitar players of the 70s. And I'm familiar with over half of these albums, but as far as quad mixes go, I've really only spent time with Blow by Blow. But curious to hear your thoughts on these.
Yeah. So there were a bunch of albums done for quad. So the first couple were from his sort of blues band, the Jeff Beck Group, which I learned recently the original singer in the Jeff Beck Group was Rod Stewart.
Yeah.
But he's not on any of these records. No. I think Bob Tench is the singer on these albums. But the first one done was Rough and Ready. And then there's the self-titled album that's just called the Jeff Beck Group. And then there's a kind of super group album called Beck, Bogert, and Appice, which, as you know, Appice was from Vanilla Fudge, I think, and I forgot what other band Bogert was from, but this was kind of like, I think they were trying to be like the American Led Zeppelin, like with this record. I mean, it's like okay, this album. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I don't love the vocals on it, but the guitar playing is always great.
Oh, always.
And then we get to, I think, the best two, which were kind of Jeff Beck's sort of fusion albums,
right?
Blow by Blow, which the writing indicating it's quad is very faint.
Wow.
So if you're in a record store, you might miss this.
Yeah, you could accidentally have a quad version, not know it.
And then Wired in 1976 was the last one that was mixed for quad. And the digital reissues of these are also a bit complicated. So when Sony started releasing SACDs in the early 2000s, they released a multi-channel version of Blow by Blow, which uses the quad mix, but it doesn't like say so anywhere in the packaging. Like I think they were just marketing it as 5.1 when they really used a quad transfer. And there are a couple other editions of this that came later. So like Sony did a 7-inch version of it, like with the Santana ones. And there's also the company Analog Productions, who do SACDs. They also reissued it with the multi-channel layer as well. And I'm pretty sure all of these are sourced from the same tape transfer. Like it's not like they played the tape again to do it for the other SACDs. And that's just my opinion from having heard all three of them. And then for the other albums, your only options are the 7-inch ones. So Rough and Ready, you can see it's got the gold border quad packaging. Beck, Bogert, Nappus. There's also a DTS CD of this album, which I don't have, like we were just talking about with Abraxas. And then Wired. And there's also, for the Orange album, for whatever reason, I don't have it in front of me. I must have left that.
Beckola?
No, I was going to talk about for the Orange record.
I think Beckola has an orange on it, or no, it's an apple.
This one, the Jeff Beck.
Right. Okay.
7-inch edition of this, which I don't have, and the Audio Fidelity label did an SACD of it about 10 years ago that has the quad mix on it. So for all these records, you can get digital versions.
Cool. Now, and I don't know if they're in print or not. That's the thing.
That I couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
I would say most of them were released like in the late 2010s, like 2017, 2018. So they're not like from that long ago, but they, considering, you know, the market for these products are very small, they probably didn't press that many of them. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, for both of us, our favorite albums are the fusion-y ones. So we could sort of focus on those.
Right. Yeah. I think Jeff Beck is at his best when he's instrumental.
So I think you were telling me that you very much enjoyed the quad mix of Blow by Blow. Yes.
And what I was going to mention is that I've loved Jeff Beck for probably more than 10 years now. And, you know, I knew all of these albums, you know, going in, and, but going back to Blow by Blow, that was always my favorite. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. But something that stuck out to me was the track, 'Cause We've Ended as Lovers, where his guitar solo is kind of panning around. And you might notice that it starts almost all the way justified in the back. And then when he starts to take like the leads, it'll come forward. And I thought that was so interesting.
More often than not on the album, the guitar leads are in the back, which is a little bit jarring at first when you think about how, you know, modern 5.1 Atmos mixes are typically done. Like, I'm sure if like we had a Steven Wilson mix of one of these records, like the guitar would be at the center channel, probably. Right. But it's centered in the back. Like, it's not like in one corner. It's right behind your head. It's a pretty cool effect. And the more I listened to the record, the more I enjoyed it. Another thing that jumped out to me listening to this is there's the song She's a Woman with the talk box, and the talk box echo like goes from corner to corner. So a lot of like cool little things like that. I don't know who did this quad mix, but as you know, the album was produced by George Martin.
Yeah, and you can tell.
I suspect that maybe it was Jeff Emmerich who did the quad mix, since he engineered the stereo version, but I don't know for sure. Sometimes on the records they give a mix credit and sometimes they don't. But and then when you go over to Wired, the mixes are pretty simple. It's just kind of like drums in front, lead guitar usually in the center, like you'd expect. And then usually Jeff's rhythm guitar is in one corner, and how do you say his name? Jan Hammer? Or do you just say it like,
I was going to ask you, I think it's Jan Hammer.
His Moog synth or keyboard is usually in the other back corner. So basically kind of the same sound stage as like the Joni Miles of Isles record, where it just kind of feels like you're in the studio surrounded by the band.
Yeah, it's a shame that we never did get the Jan Hammer Group live album in quad.
That's true.
That would have been sick.
I think it came out like just too late. If it came out a year earlier, there might have been a quad mix.
because that's like my third favorite Jeff Beck record.
Yeah. I mean, this record's awesome. Like, I don't have to tell you. One thing that jumped out at me though, listening to the quad mix, there's two flaws with it, I would say. One is that in the song "Come Dancing," the keyboard solo is like really buried.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it sounds like someone just forgot to push a fader up or something. Like you can hear it at like a quarter the level it's supposed to be in one of the rear speakers.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I noticed is the song "Sophie" sounds like it has like way less separation than the others. Like maybe they didn't have like a multi-track for that song and they ran it through some kind of unfold, they did some kind of pseudo surround process. Like it just kind of sounds like the stereo mix with some reverb on it. Versus all the other songs which have like very separated, like guitar in one speaker, drums in another speaker. But other than that, I think this is pretty faithful to the original stereo version, and it sounds great. It's just like you're inside the record.
Yeah, the only thing that I noticed, I mentioned this to you before we started, was going back to Blow by Blow for just a second.
Sure.
With the guitar justified in the back speakers, I found it was a little low in the mix sometimes. Like I wanted to hear more Jeff, obviously more Jeff. So I actually boosted my back channels a little bit, like a dB and a half. And that worked better for me in general.
It could be possible that when they prepped it for the SACD, they kind of altered the channel balances to make it feel more like a 5-1 mix, where typically like the rears are subservient to the front. Versus in a quad mix where they're kind of all at equal level.
Yeah, right.
So there are, as a brief sidebar, from this series of single layer multi-channel discs from Sony that were released, in the early 2000s, a couple of them are sourced from quad mixes. Another one we're going to talk about is Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. And also the OJ's Ship Ahoy and the Isley Brothers 3+3. And I think certainly in the case of the 3+3 record, because I have the quad LP to compare it to, the rear channels seem to have been lowered quite a bit on the SACD. So it's possible something like that happened.
Interesting. Yeah, I noticed that it's like, I need to hear more Jeff. When he's mixed all the way in the back, it's like, come on, need a little Jeff.
It would, again, this would be a great candidate for like a modern Atmos mix.
Oh yeah.
If somebody wants to take a crack at it, that would be really cool.
Yeah, I would love that. I'd snap that up in an instant. So we're just plowing through great 70s guitarists now. Not to mention the fusion aspect and different exotic genres. And we're going to talk some Frank Zappa. And viewers of my channel will know that Frank Zappa is one of my favorite artists of all time. Now, do you have records to show?
I've got Frank? The only thing I've got is the quad LP of Over-Nite Sensation.
Oh, excellent.
I don't have the quad version of Apostrophe, but there was a quad LP and tape edition of it, as there was with Over-Nite. Those are the two that were released in quad. But once again, as we've learned for these box sets, there is some stuff in the vault that was done and not released until recently.
Yeah. Yep. And we'll talk about that. I guess we'll touch on that briefly, but we did get these box sets of Apostrophe and of course, Over-Nite Sensation. And both of these are among my favorite reissues, in recent memory, because you get great booklets with Joe Travers, the Vaultmeister, talking about the process, maybe how they were recorded, and then also talking about how things were compiled and why certain shows were picked, why certain extras were picked. So that's all great. I love the informational aspect of it, but you also get, 5 or 6 discs of great content with like, alternate studio versions, early versions. You get live discs. I think you get 2 shows in both of these sets, and then you get 1 show in the one size fits all one. But overall, these are great. But then you also get these Blu-rays, and the Blu-rays are like worth the price of admission, in my opinion, almost. They're kind of pricey, but on the Blu-rays you get new Dolby Atmos mixes from Eric and Karma. Yep. Eric Goebel and Karma Auger. You get 5.1 mixes. You get Frank's vintage quad mixes, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And interestingly, on the one size fits all box set, we do get some unreleased extras, like you were talking about, like Frank's vintage mix of Sofa. And there's the San Bernardino that he did like in the early
The
90s.
90s, the 6-channel mix, they call it. Yeah.
Which is absolutely mind-boggling that he was thinking that way in
But
1993.
as like a brief sidebar, it was rumored for years that Frank had finished a quad mix of One Size Fits All because it came out in the time frame that would make sense in 1975. It was kind of towards the end, but labels were still releasing albums in quad.
Yeah.
And in the liner notes, Joe mentions that they looked into doing one. And when they were recording the record, they were thinking about quad while they were doing it. Like they were using 4-channel recording techniques to capture the drums and some of the other elements. And it looks like they started on it. They mixed one track, which Sofa number 1. And then I think Frank kind of realized that like quad wasn't really going anywhere and he never finished mixing it.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, Joe has also said in interviews that the Roxy and Elsewhere album does have a completed quad mix in the vaults.
Yeah.
So whenever they get around to reissuing that album, and maybe there will also be a new mix by Carmen Eric, they could release the quad version of that. That would be cool to hear.
That's one of my big grails right now. I mean, my Zappa grails are slowly, they're coming out. Like a lot of them are here. But that's one of my last remaining ones. Is I would love to hear that vintage quad mix of Roxy and Elsewhere. And before we talk about these two vintage mixes that were released, there's also this DVD audio disc, Quadraphonic.
Quadraphonic, maybe.
Quadraphonic. I don't know how to pronounce
it. So I don't have a copy of this, but having done the research, essentially what it is like a kind of a demo reel of like unfinished quad experimental mixes that Zappa was working on. And it has, recordings from throughout his discography. Mm-hmm. I'm not exactly sure when the mixes were made, probably some point in the 70s. But probably the most interesting thing on it is it has a version of the title track from Waka Jawaka mixed in quad. And from what I've read online, people say it's an alternate take and not the one that we know from the Blu-ray. But it's interesting to know that he was thinking about mixing that stuff in quad, because on the Waka Jawaka set or the Waka Wazoo set, there were only the new mixes. There were no vintage quads available for those. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how this escaped me. I never picked this up. I also never picked up the Halloween. Well, I had the Halloween, but I think I sold it, which was a mistake. But
I saw it like in a store a few weeks ago and I almost bought it.
Really?
It's kind of expensive, but
yeah,
I've heard mixed things about it. Like some people say it's kind of more of an ambient kind of thing because it's a live show.
Yeah, that tracks for me. Cause I think Baby Snakes is kind of like that too. But yeah, let's talk about the 270s albums that were released. So
yes.
I think we can kind of talk about these in a general sense.
Sure.
Because they have a lot of the same qualities and quirks and things. But
well, when I interviewed Carmen Eric earlier this year, I asked them because I was curious if they listened to the quad mixes, and they told me not only did they listen to them as a reference when they were doing the new mixes, but they also were responsible for mastering them for the Blu-rays.
Right. And they sound great.
They do sound great. Like there's no issues with these, like on the Tull stuff where sometimes like they sound kind of muted and lacking high end. These sound great.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. And I have to say that, and this is going to sound like a criticism, and it's not, but switching between the new Atmos mixes to the quad mixes, as somebody who grew up on these stereo mixes, I find the quad mixes more authentic in a way, but the Atmos mixes are more interesting.
The Atmos mixes are certainly more adventurous, which
I
was kind of surprised by, because I would have thought Frank would go crazy with quad, but he kept it kind of conservative. I mean, I'm not going to say that quad mixes are boring, because there are some fun moments, like in the song 50/50, the vocals are flying all around, just like you would hope. In the first song on Over-Nite sensation, Camarillo Brillo, the guitar is very clearly in the back. But there's other parts of it where it just kind of feels like an expanded stereo with not a lot of sort of pinpoint, placement of instruments.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
The Atmos mixes have a lot more of that. And of course you add the elements of the height speakers too. So yeah.
Yeah. And the Atmos mixes are much cleaner sounding, and you can hear more detail in general, but there's something about like what you called the expanded stereo approach that is like a longtime Zappa fan, I find kind of sweet. I enjoy hearing them this way. And I noticed that a lot of the percussion was kind of trailing in the back. And especially on Overnight Sensation, Ralph Humphrey's drum kit, you kind of feel like you're inside his drum kit a lot of the times, which I like.
It's possible like they may have tracked the drums in a way that was conducive to the quad mix, like using room mics and things.
Right.
I'm certain they must have done that for One Size Fits All, because it was mentioned in the liners that they were thinking about quad. One question I wanted to ask you, because I don't know these albums super well, are there any instances in either Over-nite or Apostrophe where like there's different takes used or anything in the quad mix? Differences from the stereo?
I didn't notice anything. And I listened to Overnight Sensation this morning in about half of Apostrophe, and nothing jumped out at me. Now, my friend Jocko would know, and he's not even a quad head, but he would have a stereo fold down. He'd be able to give us a list of things that were different, because I know that there was a release of Apostrophe that had a little extra dialogue in it. That was a CD release, and I always thought that was a quad fold down. But now that we hear the quad mix, they're not there. So it's kind of I'm kind of confused about that myself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it tracks that the mixes would be faithful to the originals because they were done by Frank and Kerry McNabb.
Yeah.
And they were done relatively close in time to when the stereo versions were.
Yeah.
I think Apostrophe was a retrofit, like it was done shortly after the stereo. I mean, sorry, Overnight Sensation was the first one that was done. I think it was done after the stereo version was already released. But for Apostrophe, they may have done them at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just noticed that, like, from an audiophile standpoint, we'll say that it's very clear. And the instruments have a very warm and present sound to them, especially the drums. And one other thing I wanted to note was that this is the only album on our list that has a meta moment in the lyrics, because Frank mentions she said her stereo was 4-way.
Yes, this is true. I mean, Joe Travers has been saying in interviews and in these liner notes over the years that Frank was a huge fan of surround audio.
Yeah.
As evidenced by the fact that he continued experimenting with surround after quad was gone. Like he did that 6-channel mix in the 90s of San Bernardino that we were talking about. Like he mixed in all these sort of different experimental multi-channel formats, most of which were never released to the public. Mm-hmm. And it's too bad that he passed away like just before 5.1 came out.
Yeah. It is.
Like, yeah.
There's even some of his later, like his classical material, that has been mixed for 6-channel. Like, I think I've read that some of Civilization Phase 3 was done for 6-channel, and the Yellow Shark, the orchestral album, and also the Varese album, The Rage and the Fury, that's not out. It hasn't been released yet, but that was also recorded for and mixed in multi-channel. And those who have heard The Rage and the Fury and know Varese's music say that that is the best recording of that material. So I really hope that comes to light one of these days.
It's kind of sad because like another example of this would be like Jimi Hendrix, who, as you know, in his stereo mixes, he loved trying to create the impression of something beyond, and he passed away just before quad came out. Mm-hmm. So I think, a lot of cases when they go back and remix these records and the artists are no longer with us, you wonder, like, is this something that they would have wanted? But I think certainly for Frank, he would have been all over mixing these records in Atmos. Yeah.
I always say he'd have been driving us nuts with it. But now that I've heard some of his early mixes, I think, would he? Because like you said, it seems like Karma and Eric's mixes are much more adventurous.
Well, it's a whole different thing. Like the whole idea of object-based mixing and having additional speakers above you. Who knows what he would have done with it? It would have been interesting to hear.
No, I would love to have heard what he'd done with this technology. So we're going to now talk some Pink Floyd, another favorite band of mine.
Perhaps you could say they're the definitive surround sound band. I think that's a fair statement.
I can see that, sure.
So, again, like so many of the artists we've talked about, there's a mix of released and unreleased material that has come out over the years. But the albums that were released on quad, LP, and tape in the 70s were Adam Heart Mother. I've also got the 8-track. So Adam Heart Mother, this is a German pressing. You can see it says Quadraphonic. Of course, Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
And Wish You Were Here. This is the quad pressing, but basically the original pressings had like a sticker on them that said quad that was long gone by the time I got this used version. But and people have been saying for years, like it was rumored that Animals was mixed in quad, but I think it came out like just too late.
Yeah,
like
that's 77.
If it was done like a year earlier, it might have been.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot is written about, particularly Dark Side of the Moon in quad. As people know, the mix was done by Alan Parsons, who was the recording engineer and kind of shadow producer of that album, you could say. And Alan would tell you, because there was an interesting interview with him that came out. So for the 30th anniversary, just to go into the modern versions, James Guthrie did a 5.1 mix of Dark Side of the Moon in 2003.
And that sounds great.
Which has been reissued, multiple times over since then. And the quad mix was not released digitally until 2011 in the Immersion box set. So you can see here, it's got the 70s quad mix and Guthrie's 5.1. And same for Wish You Were Here. There's also an Immersion Blu-ray. And we were very excited to learn that the quad mix of Wish You Were Here is going to be in the new Atmos edition coming out in December.
Yep.
Now, when they remixed Dark Side and Atmos for the 40th anniversary, or is it the 50th? The 50th.
I think 50th.
They did not include the quad mix on the standalone Blu-ray or the box set, which was too bad. But I'm glad they're doing that for Wish You Were Here. So back when the 5.1 mix was done in 2003, supposedly the band was given the option of just putting the quad mix on the SACD, like was done for Jeff Beck's Blow by Blow or Headhunters. And apparently they listened to it and they decided to have it redone instead of using the quad mix. And Alan Parsons himself has been very vocal over the years in saying that the quad mix was basically like a rush job, because nobody knew that the album would become like this legendary classic at the time.
Yeah.
So he kind of did it by himself, like without any of the band there. And he says he did it on a mixing console that had no automation. So he had to sort of sit there by himself and fly in all these things at just the right moment. So when you listen to it, you can hear like it's a little bit rough around the edges. It doesn't quite have the last layer of polish that the stereo mix has. And there's a couple parts where like there's extra things in it, like in Us and Them, there's a little bit more sax on it than there is in the 5.1 and stereo mixes. But compared to the quad mix, like James Guthrie's approach, I feel, was kind of like we were talking about Zappa, like a sort of expanded stereo where you could feel the band around you, but not necessarily like different elements panned, isolated in different speakers. Whenever there are moments of isolated effects, like the cash registers and money, it's usually like for sound effects. Whereas the quad mix is kind of like you're in Abbey Road surrounded by the band. Like in the song Money, like David Gilmour's guitar is clearly in the back. Like his guitar is in one rear speaker and Rick Wright's keyboards are in the other. In the song Us and Them, like the us, it bounces from corner to corner. So it's kind of like you have a choice between, you could listen to this mix that's very faithful to the original, but it's a bit conservative given the material. And I would say that about both the 5.1 and Atmos mixes. Yeah. Or you could listen to this sort of a little bit rougher sounding version that has this crazy surround separation, like you're really there with the band. And I think both of them have their merits, and it's been debated in the community for years over which is better.
Interesting.
And then I will rely on you to talk more about Adam Heart Mother, because I'm not hugely familiar with that record, but I remember you were telling me that you thought the quad mix really added a lot to it.
Yeah, I think it's phenomenal. And if we're talking about what's the best quad mix, it's very near the top for me. And the reason for that is that I've always found the stereo to be pretty wonky. You were talking about how early quad mixes could have some pretty wonky placement and stuff because they were just testing out the tech. And I think a lot of early stereo mixes have that same issue. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Nick Mason's drums are all the way panned either to the left or the right, and the horns are all the way on the other side during the title track on the stereo mix. But listening to this quad mix, Nick Mason is stereo in the front. You can hear his toms panning and stuff. And you have the Ron Geeson arrangements coming at you from the back. And then there's also some cool situations where like David Gilmour's guitars are chasing each other.
Yeah.
When he's playing solos and stuff.
There's a section like towards the beginning of the like Adam Hart Mother suite where I remember the guitar was like walking back and forth in the rear speakers.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very impressive. And, I would never call Adam Hart Mother one of my favorites. But I love the suite. It's kind of a warm up for Echoes in a way.
Yeah.
And, but obviously with like the Ron Geeson, arrangements, but the song that I would point to as my absolute favorite on the album is Summer 68, which is a Rick Wright composition. And I can't remember what album we were talking about here recently that I said was sort of like the transition from black and white to color in, was The Wizard of Oz. Well, there's a moment in that when we kick into the chorus, the how does it feel, that bit where your entire room is just filled with sound. And I absolutely love this mix, man.
Now you mentioned metal, and interestingly enough, metal was not released in quad. So you might be wondering, why is there a gap between Adam Hart Mother, metal, and then Dark Side?
Yeah.
And it turns out that we know this because there was a huge box set called The Early Years that was released in 2016, maybe. So that's one of the individual volumes. But there's this huge box that has like 30 discs or something that covers the bands, like everything from Piper at the Gates of Dawn through Metal. And it turned out there was a quad mix of just Echoes, just the one track that was done as like, I guess like an early test or something. It was never released to the public in any way, but they put it on this box set so you can hear it in surround. It's kind of like a wonky early mix with a lot of parts where things are like panning around. It doesn't really work. But as a lot of people know, back when this set was done, Andy Jackson, who was David Gilmour's longtime collaborator, engineer, co-producer, was hired to do a full 5.1 mix of the whole Metal album and Obscured by Clouds, those two albums. But since the mixes were done without the consent of Roger Waters, they were removed from the box set. Or so people thought, because it turned out that in some of the early editions of the early years, the Metal 5.1 mix was still on there. So there is an unreleased 5.1 mix of the whole Metal album. My guess is that will not ever be released. If they ever do release that album in Atmos or Surround, it will be a new mix. Probably done by James Guthrie or maybe Steven Wilson.
Yeah.
Since he did the Pompeii album. I mean, I think Echoes would be incredible in Atmos.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I was going to say like let Steven Wilson do Adam Hart Mother, because I've always wanted to hear a multi-channel mix of Adam Hart Mother, and was able to recently, thanks to, it was released on this volume, the Deviation box set.
The individual volumes of the early years were released as separate sets later.
Yeah.
But if you want to get all the surround material, you have to buy like a bunch of them. So there's one of them that has the Adam Hart Mother quad. There's one that has the Echoes quad mix. And then there's a third one that has Andy Jackson's 5.1 mix of Pompeii, which is like totally outclassed by the Steven Wilson version that came out this year. So don't bother with that. Get the Steven Wilson version. But the Deviation with the Adam Hart Mother quad is worth getting, I think.
Yeah. Yep. I would agree with that. And then, I don't know if the complete box set is in print or not, but
it was like when it was new, it was exorbitantly expensive.
That's probably why I just went for the individual volumes for certain things that I was interested in. But I'm hoping that one day Steven Wilson is allowed to mix some of those early albums, because that seems like more his thing anyway.
So like, you mean like Piper at the Gates of Dawn, like Saucerful of Secrets, those records?
Know. I don't know if those are the multi-tracks available. I was actually talking about like the experimental period, Adam Hart Mother. I don't know if you watch Abigail DeVoe, but she just did a 3-hour video on the experimental Floyd period. And one of the things she said was, what really needs to happen is a reissue of the live part of Umaguma, or Amagama, I guess is how it's pronounced. But basically a restored version of that concert with some of the other material that they were working on at the time. And I would love to see Steven Wilson tackle something like that, like basically an immersion box set for live, the live Amagama set. But I'd also like to see him tackle Obscured by Clouds, because he's on record as saying it's a favorite of his. And I know when Steven Wilson said that was a favorite of his, everybody went back and re-listened to it, including myself. I wanted to hear it again.
I mean, my personal vote for the next reissue would be for Metal.
Yeah.
But I mean, the actual next reissue is probably going to be The Wall after this year, which they've been saying for years that Guthrie has been working on a 5.1 mix, and probably now also Atmos.
Yeah.
That'll be cool. So the last one we have to talk about is Wish You Were Here.
Yes.
Which the quad mix was done by Brian Humphreys, who engineered the record and also Animals.
I think he worked on Amagama too. Some of the early ones.
There's a quote I read online that like by the time he was finished with Animals, they said he was like mentally exhausted. Bands. So that was why they brought in Bob Ezrin to do The Wall. But I think we were talking about this off screen, and like there's moments of this mix that are incredible.
Yes.
That are better even than the modern 5.1 mix. And there's other moments where you're like, how did this happen? Like in the song Wish You Were Here, the David Gilmour's like sort of scatting and guitar solos are like off in the ether. Yeah. Like someone forgot to push a fader up. Yeah. But then like other tracks like Shine on You Crazy Diamond is incredible in this mix.
Yes. And I noticed like the very beginning of Welcome to the Machine it's an attack. It's a sonic attack, to quote our friends in Hawkwind. But it's like so much bass and just like rumbling around you. And then when the rest of the song kicks in, all that bass is gone. So it's kind of disappointing after the intro. But there's also some other interesting things. Like I thought maybe some of the solo sections were extended on the title track. And I also noticed that leading into the title track from Have a Cigar, that little radio bit plays out a bit longer.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
That's the main thing I noticed, that when the radio bit kicks in, you could hear David Gilmour's guitar keeps going after where it stopped in the stereo. Yeah. So the quad LP is interesting to collectors, for that reason alone.
And there's also something interesting that, the lead part that Rick Wright plays, that's kind of like a quote of See Emily Play.
In Shine on You Crazy Diamond.
Part 2, well, parts 6 through 9 or whatever it is, the very end of the record, the multi-track tapes that's missing. That's missing from the multi-track elements. So Rick had to re-record it.
So the story goes that when they were making the record, there's on the Blu-ray or SACD, and around the time the 5.1 mix was released, I think 2011, there was like a little featurette with James Guthrie that you could find on YouTube. And he says that like when he was when he was rebuilding the album for 5.1, he found that there's a section in Shine on You Crazy Diamond where there was a keyboard lead that wasn't on the tape, like you said.
Yeah.
So he went back and pulled the stereo tape to figure out like, was there some kind of like edit here that was done or something? And he found that essentially what they did was they mixed the entire album to stereo, and they printed like Rick Wright playing the solo live on top of the stereo mix.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's right.
So it only exists on the stereo master and nowhere else.
Gotcha.
So in the quad mix, there's a hole where that section is. It's not on there. When they did the 5.1, Rick was still with us, so they had him just play the part again.
Yeah. And he nails it. Like it sounds exactly like the original. It's probably played on the original instrument too.
So for the Atmos mix that's coming out in just a few months, I would imagine they use that same part that he recorded, 10 years ago. And as we mentioned before, the quad mix, which was previously only on the Adaprint immersion set, is going to be on the new standalone Blu-ray. So more people will get to hear it and give some comments on it.
Yeah, that's one of my most highly anticipated releases of the year. I'm really looking forward to that. So we're going to talk Oh, we get to talk some Miles.
Oh yeah.
This is some of my favorite stuff, by the way.
When I first learned about Miles, like the albums I heard were like Kinda Blue.
Yeah.
And then somebody was like, you should listen to Bitches Brew. And like didn't know what to expect. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, you're right. But you mentioned Kind of Blue. I think that would make a great quad or multi-channel mix, or even something like Sketches of Spain would have been.
So there actually are now that you mentioned it, there are multi-channel mixes of those albums.
I didn't know that.
So in the early 2000s, it's too bad I don't have it in front of me, but there was a surround edition, a single layer SACD of Kind of Blue. But the album was recorded on apparently 3-track tape, which must have been an experimental format.
Yeah.
So the mix is essentially like drums in the left speaker, Miles's trumpet in the center channel, and then the sax on the right, I think. So it's sort of like a 3-speaker mix and then some ambience in the rear speakers.
Okay.
But like it's classic material. It's one of the greatest jazz albums of all time. And it's cool hearing it with Miles in the center channel. And there's also an Atmos mix of it on streaming services that's basically the same concept, but there's also ambience in the height speakers. Interesting.
I didn't know about all that.
Yeah. And Sketches of Spain, that one, I don't actually have it, but there's a DVD with a 5.1 mix where they did some kind of stem separation process, to my knowledge, to try and make it a little bit more immersive than Kind of Blue. I've never heard it, but people have said good things about it. But to bring it to quad, the 2 albums that were done were Bitches Brew and Live Evil. So I don't have the LP of Bitches Brew, but I do have the one for Live Evil.
Yeah, I love that cover art.
Yeah.
And then it's got like the dog pimp on the back or whatever that is.
And about 5 or 6 years ago, there were Sony Japan SACD editions of both these albums. So these have the quad mixes.
Must-haves.
And I think you and I both agree that Bitches Brew is one of the greatest quad mixes.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And I talked about this in one of our other videos, but I don't remember if it's out yet or not. But Bitches Brew is interesting because you know how that album was created. Teo Macero was recording, jams in the studio, and he would create tape loops for the band to kind of, for Miles to kind of play, blow over it. And what's interesting about the quad mix is it opens up the album so that you can hear where those tape loops are triggered.
Yeah, that first song, Pharaoh's Dance.
Pharaoh's Dance, yeah.
You could hear like they sort of fade in from different places, and like the whole room is like swirling around you.
Yeah.
I mean, when you put this on and like turn off all the lights and listen to like at night, it's like something else. Yeah.
It's magic.
Totally.
Yeah, it's bewitching.
But aside from all the crazy stuff with the tape loops going on, it's basically, so there's 2 drummers on this album. One of them is they're kind of diagonally opposite each other. One of them, I think, is in the front left speaker. The other one's in the rear right. And then John McLaughlin's guitar is in the left back corner. And I think the what's the other instrument? It's like a clarinet or something.
Is that Bernie Maupin playing the bass clarinet?
Yeah, bass clarinet. I think that's in the other corner to fill it all out. And Miles is in the center.
Yeah, and we talked about that.
Yeah, the coolest part of it is like when he blows the trumpet, the slap backs like alternate between the backs, so it becomes this like cacophony of sound where there's trumpets echoing all around you, and
it's like you're sitting right in the bell of Miles' trumpet. I mean, maybe that's not realistically what it sounds like, but just in my head, that's what it sounds like. Is that I'm?
But it's not a realistic album. So it's perfect for this sort of thing. Like you said, it's constructed from all these edits and tape loops. So
it made me hear the record completely differently. And it kind of opened me up to its brilliance. Honestly, it was never one of my favorites before. I actually liked the one before it better, or I liked the one before it better in a silent way.
So that's a good quick sidebar, because there is a 5.1 mix of In a Silent Way that was done around the year 2000. And this is also like a great mix, like keyboards all around you, Miles in the center channel. I don't think this is too hard to find. Like it's not one of those albums where like it'll cost you $100 to get a used copy. But I think if you look around on Discogs or eBay, you could find a copy of this.
Yeah, I might have to look for that.
Yeah, but
because I think that's my favorite of all of them.
whenever I do interviews with people, I always ask them, like, if there's any record you could mix in Atmos, which would you choose? And a lot of people say like Led Zeppelin or something like that, but I've had more than a couple people say Bitches Brew. And I've always had to say, like, well, there's this great quad mix of it, if you haven't heard that. But it would be cool to hear an Atmos mix of Bitches Brew.
So then there's also, you mentioned Live Evil,
Yes.
which I took a listen to. And it's not quite as gonzo as Bitches Brew is, but it's kind of like a mixture of a live, and then there's some studio stuff in there too. Yeah, how would you describe the placement on this? Because I thought this one was really unique as well.
Not dissimilar to Bitches Brew. I know for sure I heard John McLaughlin's guitar in the back.
Yeah.
For me, this is like a pretty difficult album. Like,
yeah, sure.
If I want to hear this kind of stuff, I probably would opt for Bitches Brew or In a Silent Way over this.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the interesting things about this album and Bitches Brew is, remember how I was saying before that generally with Columbia Records releases, your choices were either the vinyl that used that decoding process that sometimes didn't really work well, or you could get these 8-track cartridges that had the discrete 4-track separation. In the case of these Miles records, maybe because they were sort of more avant-garde and they were 2-record sets, there was no 8-track variant of these. There was only the vinyl. So until these SACDs have come out, people had been listening to the quad mixes in like a flawed state for 50 years.
Yeah.
So no one got to hear how the real separation sounded until these versions came out. But that's not to say like the quad LP of Live Evil still sounds pretty trippy, but the SACD's better.
Yeah. I thought these sounded like modern mixes. Like,
yeah,
they sound like they could have come out today. And especially the Bitches Brew one is so immersive. And I think I mentioned this in the other video that I could tell that some things were like physically higher. Like, it seemed like certain things I was hearing were actually coming from the ceiling. And as you can see, I just have bookshelf speakers mounted behind me. But it sounded like it was towering down from above me, which was awesome.
There's like little sections throughout the record where if you listen really closely, you can hear Miles like cueing the musicians in.
Yeah, I love that.
Section where he could be like, John,
Yeah, I love that. And we're bouncing around a little bit. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, this is an example of like, sometimes people say like how multi-channel or surround can turn you on to music you wouldn't normally listen to.
Right. Yeah.
Like, this is not an album where I'd like really want to sit down and listen to the stereo version, but in surround it sort of becomes something else entirely.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's a better way to hear it, period. Because it as I mentioned before, it opened this album up for me, and I'd heard it many times before in my life, but I feel like now it's my favorite. So that's a great mix. And I was also going to mention, talking about Live Evil, there are moments where John McLaughlin is traveling, sort of like we were talking about, like David Gilmour and Adam Hart Mother. There's some really cool panning stuff in that too.
Yeah, those are great mixes. I don't know if those discs are still in print. Probably not.
The Bitches Brew one is not.
The Bitches Brew, it was released in 2018, the SACD. So
until very recently, it was on Amazon for like $40. I remember thinking, oh, gee, $40. I don't know if I want to spend that. It's like, now it's $100.
You can get into trouble waiting on these things.
Yes. So don't wait. That's the.
We got a good segue here from Miles. To Herbie.
Because Herbie's on. He's on Live Evil, right?
He's also on In a Silent Way, I think. But
I think Chick Corea's on Bitches Brew. I can't remember if Herbie's on that one, but they're both on Live Evil.
In a Silent Way, like, they're all on there, like all the greats of 70s fusion, like the it's got Herbie, it's got Chick Corea, and Joe Zawinul from Weather Report. So all three of them are playing keyboards on that album. So yeah, let's talk about Herbie.
Yeah. Do you have LPs?
Yes, I do. So sweet. I don't have all of them. So there are 4 albums by Herbie that were released in quad. Of course, Headhunters. My high school jazz band played Chameleon.
I auditioned for jazz band. I auditioned for jazz band on Watermelon Man. So
nice.
Yeah.
So Headhunters. And then the other albums were Sextant, which came before Headhunters, and that has a different band on it. Thrust, which uses the same band as Headhunters. And then the last one, which I've got, was called Secrets. And this like was a very like late in the game quad LP. You could see the logo is so small. Like I think this is one of the last ones to come out from Columbia.
It's like they were trying to trick people into buying quad.
Yeah. So if you want to get these on modern formats, there's the original. There's a couple different versions of Headhunters. There's the original single layer edition, like the Jeff Beck one, that has one of these stickers. Then the version I have was in 2016. Analog Productions did a reissue of it that has the quad mix on it, or it's the 5.1 mix, which is really the quad. And there's also a Japanese 7-inch edition, like the Santana and Jeff Beck. And I've heard people say that might be a new tape transfer, but I'm not sure about that because I haven't heard it. So then for Thrust, there's the Audio Fidelity quad SACD, which came out in 2015. And for Sexton, Dutton Vocalion, which is a label we haven't talked about yet, but we should, because they've done tons of SACD reissues of 70s quad stuff. They did a SACD of it in 2019.
Oh, nice.
And I believe you could still buy this. So
cool.
For me, the only one of these that I knew before collecting the quad stuff was Headhunters. And it is a great quad mix. You know, right from the beginning of Chameleon, all the different instruments are kind of added from corner to corner. You know, it starts with the drums in front, then the plucking bass is in one of the rears, saxophone in the front, you know, different keyboards in the back. There's some crazy stuff happening with like Herbie's solos swirling around the room in Headhunters. So that's a really good mix. But I think the standout from a mix perspective, not necessarily from music, is Sexton.
Yes.
What a crazy album.
It's nuts. And I was going to say that that one, I would easily put that in the same category as Bitches Brew, and that it sounds like a modern Atmos mix. And some of those like sequencers and stuff that he's using, I can imagine those being converted to objects and beds. Like in my mind, like it's like, geez, this is like a good 50 years ahead of its time, compositionally speaking, not just the mix. But the other thing that strikes me about this is it's a weird album, and it really does put you out on the edge sometimes of what I can physically take. But the one thing I noticed is that there's a lot of really memorable melodies on this album, and it kind of gets stuck in your head.
Yeah. It's been a while since I've listened to it, admittedly, but I remember the quad mix was like off the wall. It was crazy.
Yeah. It's phenomenal.
And then
that's another favorite.
The other album, Thrust, is very much in the vein of Headhunters, because it makes sense because it's the same band, the same kind of like funk fusion sort of thing. I would say listening to this SACD, it sounds a little bit like flat to me, kind of like the Tull stuff, where it could have used a little like extra EQ to liven some of it up. I'm hoping that the Japanese Sony will do a 7-inch edition of this soon, because they recently did Headhunters. So I would say that if people are looking to get this, like, don't pay out of print prices for this disc. Just wait a couple years and see what happens.
Yeah, good advice. I think I would dig some more Herbie, just jazz in general, in quad or multi-channel formats.
And then there's the last album, Secrets, which hasn't been released on any kind of digital format yet. There's just the quad LP. And there was an album released between Secrets and Thrust called Manchild. For whatever reason, there was no quad release of that one. But who knows? Maybe it's a situation like Miles Viles, where it was done and it's sitting in the vaults. That would be a cool finding, because that's also a great record.
Good stuff. So we're at our final artist here. We're going to talk some Gentle Giant. And this was my idea. So I can't remember, were these released before? I didn't think that the interview one was.
They were not. Neither of them were.
Okay. So these are both came out in whatever, 2020, 2021, something like that.
So the albums we're talking about are Freehand and Interview.
Right.
And originally these were released, there were CD/DVD sets that were released in the UK. There were a couple of these, like they're not quite a series, but there was an edition of Deep Purple's Stormbringer released in this format, a DVD with the quad mix, and also the first Electric Light Orchestra album. These all came out like in the early 2010s. So it turned out that these two albums were mixed in quad. but never released on LP or tape.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it makes sense because their label Chrysalis, which is the same label Jethro Tull was on, released stuff in quad. I don't know why they weren't released, and I think the band was involved in their creation to some degree. So if you want these today, if you get the new Blu-ray editions that have the Steven Wilson mixes, they also come with the quads.
Yeah, which is awesome. I love it when they do that. It's like I have so many quad mixes and I didn't know I had them. Instant collection.
How do you feel about these quad mixes?
I think Interview's a lot better. It seems like Freehand is a bit kind of like what you would call an expanded stereo mix. And I also think there's some problems with the transfer itself. Like I shouldn't say the transfer, but it seems like it's mastered a little bit heavy-handedly, if you'll excuse the pun. But I think Interview is a lot better. And what's fascinating is, again, this is another example where Steven Wilson's Atmos mix placement is very similar, I feel, to the Interview quad mix.
I mean, I think Freehand is one of Steven's best Atmos mixes.
And so that's a great point, too.
I can't say I would sort of opt for the quad over that. Like, there are certain things he did. Like, I'll give you an example in the song On Reflection. That, you know, it makes sense. It's obvious to put each of the vocals in a different corner, which they did on the quad mix. But he took it a step further when they sing the all around part. They start spinning around the room, and in the quad mix, it doesn't do that, and I missed it. Like that was a good example of something that didn't happen in the stereo version, but it was a good use of, like, it's sort of like the music was calling for it.
Right.
Like he tends to be very good at kind of making panning decisions that make sense with what the music suggests, even if there are things where he's taking creative license. So that's kind of a good example of that. But yeah, I agree with you. It sounds kind of harsh compared to the other mixes. There's some moments with interesting separation. I don't know the album well enough to know if there was like different stuff in it or not. As far as
tell. No, I couldn't tell really. But that was my feeling. It was sort of like the leap from the Zappa quad mixes to the Carmel Auger and Eric Goebel work. You know, which you're talking about, like more adventurous panning and moving things around, and it just, like, you know, maybe Steven's mix isn't as faithful, but it's a lot more fun. And it's just kind of unfair to compare this quad mix to what I think is really one of the greatest Steven Wilson mixes. So I felt a lot. Would you agree that Interview's a lot better though?
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. But I also thought that the Interview in Atmos wasn't quite as good a mix as Freehand.
Interesting.
I mean, it's close, but I mean, they're both good. All the Gentle Giant mixes are good in their own way. But I think if we talked about this in another video, but I think the best mix is probably Power and the Glory, even though it's only 5/1. But the one I would recommend to people as, like, this is what this band is all about, is Freehand. I think it's sort of the easiest to digest of the existing ones.
I'd even say that just for stereo listening, like in general, that's the one to start with.
I was gonna say, I think it was their highest charting record in the US. I mean, it wasn't like very high at the chart. It was like number 50 or something. But compared to the other ones.
It's almost like a perfect balance of, like, album-oriented rock with that Gentle Giant eclecticism. So it's a great way to be introduced to the band, and it's almost like pop tunes in a way, but they're, you know, all this Baroque harmony and different, you know, experimental arrangements, and like marimbas flying in there.
For them, like the first song, Just the Same, is like pretty straightforward for a Gentle Giant song. I mean, granted, there's that whole breakdown section with, like, the swirling keyboards and the whole thing with the finger snaps. But for them, that's a pretty straightforward song, you know, compared to something like, I don't know, like Peel the Paint. or Proclamation.
Yeah. Well, you think of where they came from is like the R&B group, Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. So it's really not that far outside of their grasp to do something that's very accessible. So yeah, I would agree with you that this is a starting place. I mean, whether you're looking for a great Atmos experience, is like, hey, what's a Gentle Giant record to check out? Freehand. Or if you're just getting into the band in general, I think it is. But this is a good segue for the final part of our conversation, where we're going to live up to the video title and discuss what is the best quad mix. So Jonathan, I'll let you go first. What do you think is the best?
Well, it's an opportunity for me to bring up some ones that we didn't talk about in the video.
Yes.
But of the ones we talked about, I would say the best mixes are probably Bitches Brew and maybe like Dark Side of the Moon. I would say I'd put up there. But yeah, Bitches Brew is one of those records where like you if you are into surround at all, you absolutely must hear that mix because it's really cool.
I agree. Yeah.
But as far as like other ones that we haven't talked about, I mean, there's so many. One of my favorite bands is Aerosmith. And a couple of classic Aerosmith albums were released in quad during the 70s. Get Your Wings, Toys in the Attic, which is probably their most famous record, and Rocks. I would say none of these have been released on disc at all. You can only get the vintage LP or tape, but the quad mix of the Rocks album is incredible. Definitely worth checking out. You know, very like raw early Aerosmith. As far as other ones, the Doobie Brothers, they had 4 albums that were released in quad, which were recently released on a Quadio box, kind of like Chicago or Joni Mitchell. Definitely check those out. Like the albums are Toulouse Street, The Captain of Me, What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits, and Stampede. Those are kind of like, if you're a fan of, I don't really want to call it yacht rock, but like kind of more sophisticated, kind of jazzy rock. There are a couple of Billy Joel albums that were released in quad. Recently, Piano Man came out on SACD, and that's a pretty cool mix. I mean, man, there's so many. Like, I could go on all day. Jeff Beck, we talked about. Let me think of like one more. There's got to be something else. This is a kind of random one for a band that many people may not have heard of, but there's a band called Poco in the 70s, kind of like a country rock, sort of think in the vein of the early Eagles albums, you know, songs like Take It Easy or Peaceful Easy Feeling. They had a bunch of albums that were released in quad. There's an album called Cantamos that was released on an SACD by Doug O'Kalian. If you like, I believe it's still in print. If you like that kind of like 70s country rock sound, the quad mix of that record is incredible. So that'll be my list for now.
Great choices. Well, I think I'm gonna do 3. So Bitches Brew is my favorite, and it might be my favorite multi-channel mix of all time, which is saying a lot.
Okay,
but it just how much it like woke me up, we'll say, on the brilliance of that album and allowed me to hear it. And this is an album I've been listening to for over a decade, but I feel like I finally heard it when I heard the quad mix. So what greater praise could I give than that? And
totally, yeah.
I think from a strictly technical perspective and like comparing to the original mix, I think Adam Hart Mother is really close, even though it's not my favorite Floyd album by any stretch of the imagination. I just think what they were able to do with it is a great improvement over what I'm used to hearing. And then I would also throw in Joni Mitchell's album Miles of Miles as just an absolute favorite. It's just, there's so many delicious little sounds and things happening around the room, and it just make me feel like I'm part of the music and part of the band. Those are my top 3. I might have a few others in there.
Well, you know, if you'll indulge me, one more I'll throw in that I just thought of was Deep Purple's Machine Head. And without getting too far, there are several different quad mixes of that. There are 2 quad mixes and multiple other, like there's a 5-1 Atmos mix. But in 2003, there was a UK edition of the SACD that had the European market quad mix. And I think that is a great sounding mix. Again, kind of like we talked about in some of the other records, like it's just kind of like you're in the studio surrounded by the band. Yeah. Mostly static placement, you know, keyboard and guitar often behind you, drums in the front. And, you know, that's one of my favorite rock albums of all time.
Yeah, I need to hear a little bit more of that one, but I've listened to it a little bit, and it's an impressive one. I want to thank you for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun, and looking forward to our conversations in the future. It seems like the multi-channel, the surround announcement videos are going to become a thing. So I'm looking forward to doing that very soon. But for those of you who are watching, I'm hoping that my connection is held out and I'm not a blurry, pixelated mess right now. But we'll just say I'm not. And I'd like to encourage anybody who's watching this, let us know what your favorite quadraphonic mix is, because we had to like whittle this down to some sort of structure, because there's so much. We could have been here for 5 or 6 hours and only scratch the surface. So let us know what are some of your favorites. What did we forget? And who knows, maybe we'll do another discussion like this at some point if there's a good response. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because like I said, I have more content planned with Jonathan. We're going to do those monthly announcement videos, and whatever else grabs us and seems like it'd be an interesting thing to talk about. So thank you once again for joining us today. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope to see you real soon.
Yeah.